Hi, my name is Winslet, and welcome to my video going over mind control in Age of Wonders 4. While I always knew how good mind control was, I only recently found out how I can increase my chances to get status effects through things like Sundered Defense and Sundered Resistance. If we look here, both the Sundered Defense reduces status resistance by 1, and the Sunder Resistance reduces status resistance by 1, making it a lot easier to take units like this, run them forward, and mind control a unit. Right now, it's saying I have like a 40% chance, 26% chance, a 21% chance, and like a 66% chance with this unit. While it's not necessary to use that to take over one of these tier ones, because I could be using this Lightbringers Dominate ability, which is just generally a better mind control effect. It might be useful to drop it on, like, say, this unit to try and mind control a more valuable unit. So let's go ahead and just watch what would happen to the mind control um, odds on that T3 in particular. If I were to try and mind control with this unit, that's saying 39% chance, and this one is saying we have a 26% chance. 39 and 26 is going to change into, we got both of those there. That's good. I think that one's just guaranteed, which is very nice. Now it's a 48% chance to dominate and a 32% chance to dominate. It is worth discussing why this unit has a lower chance to dominate a target, and that's because it's a tier 3 that does other things. It doesn't just seduce units or dominate them or mind control them. All three of those things mean the same thing in Age of Wonders 3. Dominate, seduce, and mind control have the same effect. When it fails, it's distracted, which makes it easier to finish off a target that you are unable to convert over to your side and make their actions your own. In case you weren't familiar, let's go ahead and just like use this on and somebody that's basically guaranteed, like the 99. This will give me their action points, and now I can do fancy stuff with them. Um, and if we look here, they've got this nice revitalize, which removes negative status effects like condemn, which is another thing that reduces the effects of the chances that statuses will go through. It's a -3 status resistance to have that condemn effect on people. So you combine that with like the Sunder resistance and the Sunder defense, and you're going to be getting not just a lot of mind controls, but a lot of just statuses on the enemy. The Lightbringer itself is not a particularly good unit. A lot of people don't like them because they get killed off very quickly. Sure, you can mind control the unit, but then if the enemy is just able to kill this guy, it breaks the mind control and they get the unit back. So generally speaking, the Lightbringer is something that people have been avoiding. But I want to play around with this unit more, see if I can get this build to work. Maybe put the that bomb ability from the Dragon Tome. They can like throw bombs if they're a certain battle mage unit. I've seen that work in skirmishes. One interesting thing about the way Sundering Defense and Sundering Resistance works is if you bolster it back up, then that will counter the resistance being lowered and the status resistance being lowered, or the if the armor was lowered, then it will take you basically back to normal status effect resistance. And then there are other ways that you can bolster your status resistance through units like the supports who have warding. Warding will allow all the units standing around a unit to get +3 status resistance, which is not nothing at all. I think, yeah, this one also grants bolstered resistance to units standing around it. So if you can get your support units and your shield units up to their exalted rank, that's one neat way to try and counter the mind control ability from other units. We haven't talked about how the Reavers have a very special mind control effect, and that's because it works quite differently than everybody else's. Their support can subdue enemies, which means that if they have something like immobilized, frozen, or stun, you can basically keep them from getting any actions for the rest of the fight. This unit that got mind controlled from the Lightbringer, he keeps getting to act, he keeps getting to attack the old allies of his with the actions on the enemy turn. But when you subdue a unit, what ends up happening is that unit doesn't act, and I believe that means that this unit can still move around. You just need to keep them alive and probably away from the fight because the other enemy will want to try and kill this unit off as quickly as possible. Right, and the other big difference with this unit is when you defeat the enemy, you get to use a special resource. You get to use war spoils to try and recruit the enemies that were subdued, versus if a unit was mind controlled, then a non-Reaver faction would have to use mana at a relatively inefficient rate. I think it would cost more than it would to summon in the same tier unit. So I think generally speaking, it's better to use like casting points and mana to get those units on the board. But if you just need to kind of fill in the spots, it can be a pretty useful tool to just get a couple more units. So now let's actually take a look at which units I can subdue. While it might be very tempting to use the subdue ability on the Lightbringer, or to try and use it on the Lightbringer, what ends up happening here is it has the tag control loss immunity. It's kind of like a ruler. It can't be mind controlled using things like Berserk or Dominated. And I believe even if you were able to subdue a Nymph that had seduced a enemy, those units would still belong to your enemy faction, unlike this guy who's been mind control. He can act, but if a mind controller is subdued, their unit that they mind control will continue getting to act. And yeah, I think if you combine those two facts, we kind of want to not be mind controlling these types of units. What we want to try and do is get some of these lower tier units that are easier to put the immobilize tag on. Of course, they're in defense mode. But we do have this spell here, which should allow us to immobilize one of them, right? No. Did I really just put them in cover? No. Okay. All right, there we go. You should be able to get subdue to trigger on him now. 90% resisted. All right, we got two of you. 90% twice. What are the odds? All right, so now he's been subdued. You can see that he doesn't change color, kind of like this guy, which means, yeah, you don't want to be subduing mind controllers to try and get your action back. That wouldn't be efficient. While this isn't a strategy that I use, I have heard people who play a lot of the play by email or a lot of single player like the subdue ability because it takes enemy actions away, and then you can come back at the end of the fight and still kill off the unit. If you wanted to, you could try and keep the unit, but that means that you won't get the experience from killing off these like marauder stacks that are just all over the place. And I think it's just generally more efficient to subdue them to take away the damage that they can do and then just kill them to get off, to get the experience on your units that actually matter, like your heroes. Now, before we move on to the database to just talk about things a little bit more generally so we can look them up more quickly and compare them more easily, I did want to mention that heroes come with a randomly generated ability or skill or attribute. This guy has Cull the Weak, and there is a chance that you can get Seduction through that ability. And I find that to be very risky because it means putting your hero very close to the enemy, and then the enemy's going to have um, a pretty good chance of killing it off, and they'll probably want to kill off that unit so that they can get their unit back, get their actions back as soon as possible. So while it is quite good, it is very risky, and I think there are some better skills that you can pick, or better heroes that you can pick for their skills, if that's what you're picking them for. All right, so if you're not familiar with the Age of Wonders 4 database, this is a community-made project to make it easier to search up certain things that are in-game. Right now, I've just searched mind control and it actually didn't do a great job of finding the number of things that interact with mind control, but I think it did a better job than the in-game encyclopedia. So right here, you can see that it mentions a spell and a siege project that have to do with mind controlling. If you want to have a pretty good chance to mind control your enemies that are magic origin, well, this is 90% chance, so it's very likely to go through, and it's something that you can access from a tier 2 tome. I think I'm zoomed in a little bit, so it's covering that. Yeah, so this is a tier 2 tome. So you can get it pretty early. You just need to be going against somebody who has magic origin units, so you probably don't want to pick that tome for this interaction until you know what your enemy's bringing to the fight. The next thing that they mention is the Incite Rebellion, which is a tier 5 tome. It comes from a tier 5 chaos tome. If we go tier tome of the Chaos Lord, this is a very strong siege project, but it's something that you're just not going to get online in most matches when it would be useful. It'll just come online a little bit too late. But yeah, as you can see, it turns 3 non-hero units into mind control units. I think if somebody has it on my city, I'm not letting them complete the siege. I'm attacking them because that's really bad. That's really risky to allow them to get Incite Rebellion. I did go into the search bar here and look for all the units that can subdue. We only have the Overseer who has the subdue ability. I tried to find all the units that had the seduce tag, and it looks like the Nymph is the only one that has a ability called subdue. But as you can see here, it says dominated. So when we go into dominate, we can see that we have the Nymph and the Lightbringer and some other information. We have a hero skill, the this is a subjugator one, so it has a chance of inflicting dominated. I don't play a lot with the Ascension, so this is something that I don't really consider part of the base game. The Wand of Domination does remind me that there is a item in the item forge. I think takes 3 silver tongue fruit to make that does dominate enemies, but that's kind of like the Incite Rebellion. That's not going to be something that you can reliably get online early enough to make it something that you rely on um, in most matches. But if you do have a lot of silver tongue fruit, why not? This is a very strong ability. I think this can apply on like tier 4s and tier 3s. I forget when all of the units start getting mind control loss immunity. But I think tier 5s definitely have it, and heroes can have it. Heroes can give it to animals using what was the tome? It's a nature tome. I think it's Vigor has animal handler, and that allows you to just avoid mind control loss immunity across a lot of different units, not just the animals, but also your cavalry. So if you've got a lot of the new raptor mounts and animals to go with it, you probably want animal handlers to deny people mind control. I think the fact that you get extra resistance on top of this is massive. It's one of the best support skills you can get, but there are a lot of really good expert hero skills in general, not just support expert hero skills, although I do find myself having a hard time picking sometimes between all those nice support skills versus I know what I'm getting when I'm going for a martial character or a battle mage character. Um, we did mention how there are a lot of different ways to sunder defense and sunder resistance, which will reduce status resistance. But I did want to highlight here that there are all of these units that interact with sundering the defense, like the Warhound. Just when it hits guys, it sunders defense. I think that's true with the Dark Knight as well. And the Awakener has an AoE that can sunder defense. It's quite a nice AoE. But yeah, past that, we have all these spells here. This one is like a magic victory thing, so I'll skip it. We did mention how you can apply Sunder defense across a lot of different units with the Tome of Enchantment, but I think it is worth highlighting again. This is a very good way to reduce status resistance for not just like mind controlling enemies, but just putting things like damage over time on them, or reducing their action economy with things like stun or gilded, which are relatively similar to mind control. They take actions away from the enemy, but they're not as good because you don't get the actions yourselves. They just kind of like um, say you can come into play later versus you're mine now and do damage to your old allies. I find that mind control is generally very effective, but harder to get to work, which I think is it makes sense from a balance perspective. Melt armor, yeah, it's a tier 3. It's pretty good. I don't see this one too often, but it is an AOE. It can make your enemies a lot easier to kill. But I find that I'm using the not tier 2 tome to get an AoE that sunders resistance, but rather there's an astral one that does an AoE sunder resistance and marking. I think it's called Scrying that has that. Yeah, there we go. This is the one that does marking and it does sundered resistance. So that's gonna be kind of like using condemn, because condemn is -3 status resistance, and this is -1 status resistance across 3 stacks of sundered resistance. I don't think condemn can stack versus sunder resistance can stack. So you kind of want to get as many sundered resistance as you can, as well as much condemn as possible, because they will make it so your enemy is very likely to actually suffer the status effects that you try to put on them. And that actually reminds me, I don't know how I haven't talked about this yet, but there are some very nice spells that you can use on the strategic player. There's the flash freeze and the blizzard. Both of those reduce, I think we can pull them up here pretty quickly. Both of those reduce the resistance to all status effects. So it's just generally amazing. If you can get your blizzard on a bunch of lower tier units that you can just then remove from the field, that's a very, very good use of casting points and action point economy at the beginning of a match. Of course, if you want to use this on higher tier units and freeze them and remove their actions, that's also very, very efficient. But the fact that you can flash freeze a giant amount of units with this spell, this terraforming spell, it can affect everybody in a province. So if your enemy happens to put 3 stacks in a province, you can hit all 3 of them with a -5 status resistance. That's massive. That's massive, and I kind of wish I put it further in, put it earlier in the video. But also at the same time, I think a lot of people who play Age of Wonders 4, they're already aware of this interaction. Now we can go back to the things that have sundered. We talked about a lot of these units, and we were just kind of going through the spells, right? I did show off Banefall Curse earlier, but we didn't talk about um, Mental Mark and how Mark of Prey is very, very cheap and very efficient. It's only 10 casting points and 5 mana to apply 3 sundered um, defense. Sure, that target will be distracted and slash a lot easier to kill. But if you can force your enemy to spend their actions killing their own unit, that's great. That's phenomenal. And if you don't, then that unit will get to act a lot. If they don't kill it off, then that unit will get to act a lot under your control, unless they like somehow get to the guy who did the mind control. So keep that in mind. You want to keep your mind control units relatively safe, but if you can control half the army, I don't know how much you need to really worry about that, right? Now there's some structures in here that affect status resistance as well. These are the lenses that I never ever use. Yeah, this one will inflict sundered defense on debuff spells. This one does sundered resistance. So I guess you could try and go for those buildings if you wanted to. Right, so the exposing light is like the awakener thing that I mentioned earlier. You can sunder through your melee attacks. Yeah, these things are just things that you pick up through the tomes that will make it easier to sunder your opponent slash, apply status effects. And right, you can get more status resistance through these tomes. I remember saying you can ward, that's important, that's worth highlighting, as well as the fact that, yeah, here we go. There's our status resistant reduction from cryomancy, and then there's another one from the tome of the cold dark. 2 of my favorite spells in the game. They're just so powerful. They got to get nerfed at one point or another. There's Tome of Severing, which can make it so your shield units just have more status resistance. That's not bad at all. And then if they can pass status resistance onto the units around them, that seems like a good way to just avoid like a lot of damage over time, because generally that's one of the things I fear the most in the current version of the game. If you get like 4 stacks of poison, that's a lot of light damage every turn. Um, Guys Chosen gives you extra status resistance. Inquisitor's Mark makes it so you can condemn an enemy, you can weaken them, you can slow them. So yeah, condemning would be the -3 status resistance that we talked about earlier. And last thing in here, I feel like we could talk about the equipment and skills, but the last thing that I feel like we really want to talk about is Anointed People. It comes along online relatively early. Tome of Sanctuary is a pretty good tome. I like Keeper's Mark a lot. I like Spirit Resistance a lot, and then having status resistance on top of those 2 things, I think, is a pretty good thing in general. Like it'll just help you avoid not just like the mind controls, but the damage over times and the freezes, the stuns, all of those really annoying statuses that can happen. So I did want to look at one more combat before wrapping up this video to go over some things I saw over the weekend. I actually recorded the rest of this video before my skirmish on Saturday, and I got to see some pretty interesting mind control related strategies on Saturday that I just kind of wanted to share with everybody here. So I think I missed the fact that you could use traits like Hideous Stench in my first pass of the video, and it really is very impactful being able to run some of your melee units next to a handful of units to reduce status resistance by 2 in an AoE is massive. It's worth just basically putting a unit there to die on the next turn so that you can inflict a bunch of stuns or immobilizes or even damage over time if that's what you wanted to do with the damage resistance. Putting that on a handful of tanky units like the Anvil Guard is very valuable. I noticed that the Bastion was a good one to do that on because it was really hard for Ninja's opponent, for Walker, to deal with, and it just allowed him to like park it next to 3 or 4 units and just make it easier to throw things like this Petrify down on a group of units, or the Frozen Breath that this dragon has. I think, yeah, Ninja also went for a thing that increased the range on the Dragon Breath, put a blizzard on this guy. So there was just a lot of stats effects that were coming off of the dragon. But I really liked the interaction of taunt on his anvil guards. He was just able to run them forward and then try and taunt a bunch of the lower tier units for 100%. And if they got enough status resistance lowered on those higher tier units, he was actually able to taunt some pretty high tier units that you don't want taunted, like a support. It will just like run away, take an attack retaliation, and instead of healing somebody else, it will put a little bit of damage on this anvil guard. That's sure it's not resistant, but it's not going to take as much damage as you would like it to do from that attack. I did also want to mention that you could use this trait, the resilient one, to try and counter the mind control strategy. If you play against somebody who uses a lot of status effects, you may want to pick resilient. It's not amazing in every situation, but when you're facing somebody who really relies on it, getting extra status resistance and reducing the number of turns those statuses affect you is quite massive. I think the last thing that I wanted to mention here was basically how different tier units have base status resistance that can be modified. Like this unit right here, he's got no status resistance. There's no shield up here. If I wanted to park this unit next to him, all of a sudden it's not 90% to taunt. It is 100% to taunt. So, that's a really good consideration to take. This guy's got his stuff boosted by that resilient trait, so I'm not going to be able to guarantee a, a taunt with just this situation where basically the Hideous Stench reduces it by 2, the resilient boosts it up by 2. I could reduce it by just 3 by using something like Mass Condemnation, but that doesn't take me to 100%. That just takes me to 99, I think. Right now it's saying 99. Oh, right. But then if I were to actually stand this guy in here, that would drop it down even further. But yeah, the base one tier, the tier 1 units have no status resistance unless you modify it. The tier 2s, I believe, have 2. This one's been modified by resilience. So if we compare this guy's 4 resistance to this one over here, this guy should have, yeah, 2. And then I was seeing something interesting with the tier 3s that I have here. Each of them had 3 status resistance, um, unless it got modified. And then if I look at my tier 4, it jumps up a lot to 7 status resistance. I don't see any source of status resistance here. There's no warding coming from this guy that's affecting him. So yeah, I think the tier 4s just have a considerable amount more status resistance, and then tier 5s would be similar to that, and heroes are also going to be quite resistant. I think, yeah, the order aspect makes this guy have extra status resistance, so he doesn't usually have 13. I think all heroes should have 8 status resistance. That's what this guy started with. He does have resilience, so it may be that it's getting modified by a +2, but I don't think that's the case here because this guy doesn't have resilient and he just has the +5 from order aspect. Yes, the dragons are a bit weird with some of these modifiers. They get them, but it doesn't seem like it was affecting his status resistance, but maybe it would affect how long statuses would be on him. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I had for you today. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you around. Have a good one.